Voices echo in newsrooms, university classes, academic journals, and even in books. The viewpoint is that the United States is just too big to govern and that we are too fractured as a nation in order to stay united any longer. There are a number of interesting and compelling articles on this topic. Just looking around, you can go anywhere from such as a polling site that has historically been used over the last couple election cycles, 538.com, who published an article called Political Confessions, The Man Who Thinks the U.S. is Better Off as a Bunch of Separate Countries. Other organizations such as Table Mag published The Great American Breakup, in which Lou Hartz, a political scientist, argues that overpolarization and hyper-individualism is leading the United States to form a European-style confederation. There's even a book that's recently was published by F.H. Buckley called American Secession, The Looming Threat of a National Breakup, in which he foresees America dividing over political issues, not economic issues. These are just three basic viewpoints of American citizens advocating for the separation of the United States. So one should ask, is the United States itself actually too large to be governed anymore? Should the United States be broken into smaller nation states or regions in order to which better govern themselves? Well, there are a number of philosophies that have been looked over and pondered by great thinkers. Everybody from Greek philosophers to our Age of Enlightenment and even founding fathers took a look at what was the best form of governments. Would it be a small state, a small city even, or would a larger nation state be more representative and protective of people's rights? There are a few viewpoints on this, and we're going to discuss a couple of them. One of the first is when we look at the Greeks, you have Aristotle and you also have Plato, who build key ideas on the size of governance. One of the things that the Greeks really pushed for and believed in was that commonality was the key to maintaining the state. Plato argued that the members of a state must either have all things in common or nothing in common, or some things in common and some not. But they must have some things in common for they live in the same place. So furthermore, one other key element is that the people need to be free and equal. Now, of course, we understand that they still had slaves to an extent that would help some of this free time and ability to create a nation state for people to sit around and have these philosophical arguments. Now, in order for all, in a sense, to be equal, that would mean equal access to resources. That's according to Plato. And so under Plato, his ideas are more socialist, or in some cases people believe communistic. And this wouldn't necessarily be the system that freemen would look to live underneath. So therefore, we look more towards Aristotle. So he makes some of these arguments that are a little bit closer tied to freemen, access to property, and governance also. So what does Aristotle believe? Well, Aristotle saw that a smaller nation state was needed to have good governance. And the interesting fact is that Jefferson and Aristotle would have had some very similar viewpoints. And one of those big ones was that they both believed that an agrarian society that allows self-sufficiency would be the best. And that's because it allows for self-sufficiency, but it also, once a person is self-sufficient and can maintain their own needs, they no longer need to desire the possessions of other people. Once there was no desire to possess other people's means, there would be no desire for war, conflict, or other activities that was antisocial in reality would be the best way to put it. One of the things that Aristotle notes when he talks about that is that the agrarian peoples spend their time at work and do not desire the things of others. Indeed, working is more pleasant to them than engaging in politics and ruling, where there are not great spoils to be gotten from office. So, if there's no spoils to be gained at office, people serve at the pleasure of serving the people. That was what Aristotle sought. In fact, that's what the founders also frequently sought for too, is a society that sought leadership based upon the interest of the people, not for the interest of possessions or power. When we look at this, excuse me, when they talk about this, they sit there and when we discuss that a group of people with different backgrounds, motivations, and livelihood would create a government then that is unvirtuous and selfish. And that is another thing that we look at with these philosophers, is that they seek people who are virtuous, just like we said just a moment ago. They have a higher purpose to take care of the community instead of taking care of themselves. And so in order to be virtuous, you have to be self-sufficient. And in order to be self-sufficient, you just need to exist in a smaller community where you no longer have to go out and desire what other people have. It's kind of the general viewpoint here of when we're looking at smaller governance, okay? One thing is that they say also with these peoples that the way of life is a mean one with no task involving virtue among things that occupy the multitudes of human beings who are vulgar persons and merchants or the multitudes of laborers. Aristotle again looks at that, where he sees you have a large mingling of groups such as merchants, farmers, politicians, and other people who may have various motivations behind their desire to govern. Those people are the ones who are vulgar people, and that they are going to work against the interests of perhaps the farmer. Aristotle continues on, though, looking over the size of cities and territories and what is manageable and what is needed for virtuous leadership. One thing that he talks about is that the city must be large enough to defend itself and to be self-sufficient. You can also take this into his view of the nation state. It has to be large enough to be able to take care of itself and be able to protect itself. But he also notes that this too, at any rate, is evident from the fact that it is difficult and perhaps impossible for a city that is too populous to be well managed. Again, we're looking at, even from a perspective not just a city but a nation, if there's too many people, you can't manage it effectively. Too many varied interests, too many groups commingling, too many people wanting to make decisions that could impact other people without taking in consideration those people's interests, but instead they're, again, selfish nature. So he understood this need for self-sufficiency. He understood this need that you did have to have some groups together, but it needed to be made up of enough people for it to be self-sufficient. And once it is self-sufficient, it needs to only be that size. Anything bigger than that will create tyranny or a group of people to take over the government and enact in their interests. So he says that he saw the city or the nation should meet a man's need and then be able to meet his needs without having to seek reliance upon the government or others and be self-sufficient. And that way he will be busy and occupied taking care of his concerns and his ability to make a living and not with those around him. So the other thing that he argues too is that small communities work best as they understand the people that live in them. They all look to have same common interests, goals, motivation, and typically they would have common family bonds. So you have a group of people that are very common in nature. There's not diversity of opinions and views often. They're all working together in self-interest. So this is one of the reasons why he seeks and understands small governments. Instead, if a large government existed, then he finds them unresponsive or unvirtuous. So people often would seek power over virtue. Now again, we talked about the Greeks, but we also want to look at people in the Age of Enlightenment. And so you have a couple different people in the Age of Enlightenment that also advocate for smaller government. One of those is Montesquieu. He states that people that live in a republic, being democratic or aristocratic, could only persist in a small area. In a large republic, as Montesquieu states, the common good is sacrificed to 1,000 considerations, is subordinated to various it's subordinated to various exceptions. It depends on antecedents. In a small republic, the public good is more strongly felt, better known, and closer to each citizen. And Rousseau also argues, another contemporary of Montesquieu's, that a small and intimate state would be best too, as that a small state, again, made up with people with common customs and culture, are best to rule themselves on a small scale in order to promote virtuous rule and hold debate that could be well reasoned and argued. So we look at these considerations of the benefits of a small government and a small nation state from these various viewpoints. So what about the United States? Well, one person we turn to really try to understand the establishment of the United States government, its role, and how it was envisioned to work was, of course, through James Madison. James Madison, after all, is considered the father of the American Constitution, and he wrote the Federalist Papers, which was to argue how our government should function and the reasons behind it. So what does he think about it? Well, James Madison is, as you probably would be able to tell, is the opposite of these thinkers when it came to size of government. In fact, Madison saw that a small government was actually dangerous because it would create a situation where people that live in a small community could actually be dominated and taken over or had their views overcome by those of the majority. He states that small units were vulnerable to a tyranny of the majority. That's what he considered it. So the emergence of an inconsiderate perpetual majority ruling exclusively, and if worse came to worse, ruthlessly in its own interest, would be more likely in small communities and small governments. So in the Federalist Papers, Madison makes the argument that in a large state, that when a government takes a greater variety of parties and interests, which we look at when we create the United States as a highly diverse community, he wrote, you make it less probable that a majority of the whole will have a common motive to invade the rights of other citizens. So one of the things behind also having a larger government is it takes time to change laws or impact people's rights. And so therefore, this forces for greater, longer debates among a varied group of people. Instead of just a small community with people who are persuasive, who are intimate with each other, where they can make quick, rapid change, in a large system such as the United States, it takes a long time to make any shifts or adjustments to law, policy, and how the nation itself is governed, and also what rules it's governed underneath. One of the best ways to take a look at this is how the federal government reacts to crises versus a city. We see that right now in modern America, where there has been upheaval and problems in communities, and their city government had taken swift action. Was it necessarily in the best view of the people who had elected those people to run their cities? Not necessarily. In some cases, the leadership's views might have been the same as the citizenry, but there was not much debate on the matter. Instead, they quickly enacted rapid changes which would have massive impact upon the people who lived in that city. Whereas on the federal stage, there has been arguments to making change, yet those arguments and those debates are still occurring. There has been no rapid change in federal oversight or movement towards helping states or cities try to make decisions on how certain governmental actions should occur. So as you can see, the federal government is supposed to move slow in order to protect people's rights. Small government sometimes can impact people's rights very quickly. You can look at this also from other perspectives of current situations that we're in with even the medical communities and in government structure from there, where you have some communities that impose certain restrictions upon their citizens while others are not imposing any restrictions upon their citizens. So small government, as you can see, is not always in conjunction with what they think is either best or right for their people, whereas the larger government is slow to inaction in order to weigh all the opportunities. That's kind of how it was viewed as to why the larger government is a little bit safer too. One other thing to look at, Madison was a true believer in federalism, and federalism was supposed to be able to kind of balance both of these ideas, where you have a state government that should be responsive quicker to citizens' needs and also more intimate with the citizenry. Therefore, it can represent the citizens' interests best within that state. Therefore, you do have a small government that will be able to make laws that is what the other groups of the people in the community, the direct community, which you can make the argument of the state, comparative to making change on the national level that would impact all communities. And one of the things that we talk about when we look at the argument for breaking up of the United States is federalism still being followed? For if it is not being followed, this is what creates the argument that there's too much of a fractured state of which our country exists in. If that is the case, and that there we cannot resume and go back towards federalism, then people can make the case that maybe it is time for the United States to split apart. For you will never have people be able to agree on issues anymore if federalism is not instituted and we try to debate all of our issues on a national platform. Therefore, does the United States need to break up? Is it best ruled by small states, or is it best ruled by a federal government or large national centralized government? If you can maintain federalism, then the United States should stay and is best governed as an entire nation. Both economically and socially, the United States is stronger together than apart. If people can no longer agree and decide to debate everything via a national stage, then you're never going to find consensus, and eventually you will find the need to break into smaller units. What is the view? Well, look at the philosophers and the different ideas that they have, and you can draw conclusions for yourselves if you think it's best governed a certain way. But if you look at probably the most profound founder that would be looking at this issue, James Madison, Madison believes that the United States should stay as one structured nation ruled by federalism appropriately.